Okay, I'm going to kick us off today. My name is Katrina Fenlon. I'm an assistant professor here at the iSchool and a member of the Center for Archival Futures, or CAFE. And I'd like to just introduce this center as we kick off our fall speaker series now, before we jump in with our first talk of the year. So the Center for Archival Futures, or CAFE, is a relatively new center here at the iSchool, which started up in January of this year. We're a group of interdisciplinary scholars from the iSchool and beyond, whose work intersects around archives and digital curation, but very broadly conceived. So we're interested in the systems, the processes, the institutions that care for and that enable the use of data and digital objects over time. And the various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics including data and communities, knowledge ecosystems, and the life cycles of data. The speaker series that you're here with us at today is our flagship event held on the first Wednesday of each month during the semester. We host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation, research and practice across a wide variety of organizations. And you can find previous recordings of our guest speakers from last semester from the inaugural run of our speaker series on our CAFE website, which I'll plug into the chat here in a second. And before we kick off our Fall 21 series with today's talk, I'll also make a plug for our next event on the first Wednesday of October, which is October 6th at 4 p.m. We're co-hosting a speaker along with StratLab, the iSchool's lab on socio-technical research and teaching. Sherry Wasserman of Arizona State University Center for Science and the Imagination will join us in October. So stay tuned for details on that next talk. And with that said, I'll hand it over to Jason Barron.
Hey, thanks very much, Katrina. I am delighted to introduce my good friend and colleague, Tanya Marshall. Tanya serves as the state archivist and chief records officer for the state of Vermont. In those roles, she directs a statewide records and information management program that includes 3 enterprise-wide repositories and a public research facility. And she does, in my mind, some of the most innovative future-looking ways of any state archivist in the country. Tanya actually wears more than 2 hats. She was recently appointed by the Vermont Secretary of the Senate to serve on the Advisory Committee on the Records of Congress, which was originally formed in 1990 to advise Congress and the Archivist of the United States on matters concerning the preservation of congressional records. She was also recently reappointed by the Vermont Supreme Court to the Vermont Judiciary's Advisory Committee on the Rules of Public Access to Court Records. She has held leadership positions in the National Association of Government Archives and Records Administrators, NAGARA, and the Council of State Archivists, COSA. Tanya also has a special connection to the iSchool. She actually moved to Vermont shortly after leaving the iSchool here with an MLS degree, followed by time spent as a PhD student. In the latter capacity, she had the privilege of working with Bruce Dearstyne. And so it is only fitting that among her many awards and recognitions, she received the Bruce Dearstyne Distinguished Service Award from NAGARA in 2017. According to her boss, the Secretary of State for Vermont, Tanya is a, quote, nationally recognized leader, unquote, in the field of records and archives. And I agree. And she happens to be by far my all-time favorite state archivist, not just because she invited me twice to Montpelier during peak leaf season in October to give public talks. So welcome, Tanya. We're delighted to have you here as part of our CAFE speaker series, and I turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jason. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I apologize in advance to everyone that I'm in shadow. It's just the nature of my office, but I like to say it's transparency and the sunshine of government shining through behind me. Yeah, my talk today is going to be about innovative approaches that we're doing in the state of Vermont and have been doing, and I'm going to share my slides in a minute. And I just want to thank everybody and the CAFE approach for this too. It's good to be back. It's been almost 20 years since I have set foot on University of Maryland's campus since then, but it's been 20 years, probably almost since I've been a student. So it's really great to have this opportunity. And I'm going to share my screen and get started. And with that, I'm just going to walk through. I'm assuming everyone can see it. It's a little bit hard for me to kind of tell with this setup. But okay, great. Let me just get it moving. So just in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, just some background for Vermont. And the reason I'm going to do that too is trending last year was Vermont on Twitter. And I was trying to figure out why it turned out people didn't know where Vermont was or who we are as a state. So nice background, and also lead into what we do for digital record keeping, frameworks that we apply. The digital archive specifically in terms of digital preservation and our approaches for that. Also retrospective analysis. So what we've been doing with just legacy digital information and data on our servers and what our approaches are for that. And also in terms of how we're set up in state government, different interdependencies that we have and relationship building, and the next steps that we have for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration. So just for some background for the state of Vermont is that we are a New England state. We do not border the Atlantic Ocean like the others. We're actually landlocked. To our west is New York. So we're separated by Lake Champlain. It's New Hampshire on our east, Connecticut River, and Massachusetts in Canada. Our population is just 643,000 according to the last census. So we are about the same size as the District of Columbia in population. Government's the primary is primarily at the state and local level. We do not have much of a county government. And so the role is either services are provided by the state level or town clerks or city clerks. We have 9 cities and the rest are towns. When you add public schools, and in terms of local government and state government sector is Vermont's largest employer. So it's just setting that perspective with when we get into the record keeping. Within our Constitution, we are all public servants, as is any government sector. And it's really clear within this Article 6 of the Constitution that we're accountable to them. We serve the people. That's really my role as state archivist and chief records officer. It's distinctly different than being maybe a records officer or an archivist in a corporate sector or some other. We're public sector. We serve the people. That's our goal and initiative, and that's our responsibility. Just some background for the Public Records Act, since that's all that we do is kind of framed underneath this act. This particular act was passed in 1975, shortly after the Watergate. So many states have started enacting legislation related to rights for people to have access to records. And that's really a key part for the archives, is that long-term access and rights, but it does go back to the Public Records Act. In the state of Vermont, we define the public record as any written or recorded information, regardless of format. And a lot of the question, and it has to be created or produced or acquired in the state in course of agency business. So sometimes I have individuals when we talk about that say, hold up like a little sticky note and say, is this a public record? And I say, well, did you produce or acquire it in the state of course of agency business? And it was yes. It all falls into scope of the Public Records Act. Is it data? Is it audit trails? Is it different computer systems that have different data collection that's happening? That's not something that maybe is typically viewed as a record, so to speak. Yes, it's all in scope for the Public Records Act. It also mandates that agencies and departments systematically manage, and all public agencies, so this is local and state, have to systematically manage public records in general and archival records. And we're unique in that sense of having that in our statutes. You do not see that often. And then the Public Records Act also allows and gives authority for the destruction of public records. And that can only come if it's authorized by law. So it could be federal law or state law. And if there is no requirement in law, then it sits with the state archivist, and we set that records retention requirements. Background for the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, we're kind of new to the game. We were created in 2008. So we're created as the first, 14th state in 1791, but we're actually one of the last states in legislation to have an archives. And that's unique as well to us. We are charged with administering the statewide records and information management program, which Jason Messett referenced, and that is for all public agencies. And unique also to us for state government is it covers all 3 branches of state government: judicial, executive, and legislative. And we have to do this in accordance with generally accepted record keeping principles and practices and industry standards. The other unique thing to Vermont, which isn't often, is that the state archivist has to be a classified position, it's not appointed a position. This allows for continuity across different administrations. I work for the Secretary of State. He did not appoint me, however, so across different secretaries of state, there's continuity for that. And it's also a requirement to make sure that the individual that's hired into the state archivist position is qualified by education and professional experience. So to give an overview for the statewide records and information management program, because I think it provides more perspective for the variety of what we do. We are responsible for assisting public agencies with their records and information management program. We also have to issue standards and information governance frameworks. We do the professional formal appraisals. That's how we determine the record requirements, and we issue record schedules. We operate a record center, and we take legal custody of state archival records. And then our program is also responsible for making sure that low-cost, secure repositories and systems for public records, which includes public records is inclusive of data, it's all forms, regardless of format, that they're available at the enterprise or statewide level. This means 2 or more agencies are able to use them, and that they have to be managed and operated in a way that brings about compliance. So just some overview for us. We have 19 full-time employees. We're small. Our budget is about 2.1 million. Our building, which is inclusive of the state record center, these are records that we don't take legal custody of, but we provide storage for. And also the state archives is about 42,000 square feet. These are all the different areas that we do. So some other aspects for the state archives that may not be familiar to others is that authentications and certifications, we are part of the Secretary of State's office. So we have to authenticate documents for foreign use. We actually have to make sure that they're authentic, reliable, and can move forward. We do a lot of statutory filings as well. We're the legislative clerk for the General Assembly in Vermont. So we have a lot of ties to the legality of the record keeping, in addition to the responsibilities for the preservation and access. And when we look across all these different things that we do, I provided some simple statistics though, but we do make sure that we can measure and understand where we're changing and where that growth is happening, or what people are asking us to do. Is that we did in FY21, which again is partially COVID, if not fully COVID, is about 69,000 record-related transactions across the entire staff, and majority of them are manual, meaning that the breakout that you can see for the digital archives loan, which is self-serve in some ways, it does include some work for us, but when it comes to public access and so forth, that can be self-serve, was 17,000, but the rest of the transactions that are occurring across our entire staff and platform in the whole statewide program was 69,000. Big drop though in comparison to FY19 pre-COVID, which was about 87,000 transactions. So set perspective of why we maybe are innovating and moving forward is that prior to 2003, the state archives really just consisted of what was expected by law to go to the Secretary of State, legislative acts, governor's leave office, and so forth. The total extent of the state archives was one overlay paper or microfilm, and it was only 1,500 cubic feet. In 2003, and actually Bruce Deerstein, I didn't know this until after I came to Vermont, was the consultant that was hired to legal change and facilitate that for the Secretary of State's office, was that they were given authority to identify and take custody of permanent archival records, but yet they had no authority to actually change that workflow or that process in terms of the records management piece. But with that, it expanded a little bit, but again, small. And it's only paper and analog records for the most part. And then in 2008 is when VISARA, the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, was created. And that came with it, the records and information management perspective or responsibilities, the State Record Center, which really, because agencies could not transfer records to the state archives, goes back to 1760. So it's kind of this huge set of paper records. And then we become responsible for all public records in all formats. So it's really been since 2008. And so trying to catch up with states such as Alabama that had the first state archives in 1901, Vermont's just coming along in 2008 for the most part. So some of the frameworks that we've done, and this gets into the different approaches that we've had to tackle not only all this legacy work, but also work with the digital records and start moving the whole state into a more disciplined area, is that this is really the familiar people, process, technology framework that's been around for over a decade. But what we've done is expanded on it in the sense of saying that we really want a disciplined and coordinated approach that's measurable. And how do we, people and process and technology have to work together? What's kind of the infrastructure that we need to be able to support our role in terms of managing public records and information in the state. So we've really looped down to a model that has strategy, business, which is encompassing of the different roles and people and responsibilities and legal requirements, the information and data themselves, applications, and then the technology. And so this slide right here also has a loop back of going the opposite direction, which I'll talk about in a minute. We use this framework to look for patterns. So, and also look for patterns over time, because not only are we working with active current 2021 records, but we're also working all the way back to 1760, and we're also planning and moving forward for everything that's coming after. So we're looking for those patterns and consistencies that we can rely on to build. So here's an example of just a way of working opposite, is a sense that we do a lot of reports, and I have a link for that on our website just to give a deeper dive, and I'm not going to get directly into the blockchain, but we've done 2 reports on blockchain. And so this is one example that we had that was from 2019 to report back to the legislature. So it's required. And it's to start with actually the technology. And so in doing that approach, we use this framework to really work through the whole process. So this one we're asked to use, look at blockchain technology specifically for public record keeping, and then specifically related to recording of land records as well. And so what we've done in that report is really, we tease out that whole thing, starting with what is the technologies being asked, what's the application component, what's the information and data and records that are expected, and what's the business need and legal requirements around that, and what's the strategy. And so this one really came up because land records are still largely paper-based in the state of Vermont, because we do not have a county government. It is done at the town level. So you're talking about 251 independently elected recorders. It's somewhat difficult for stakeholders to access and do land records research for marketability title and so forth. So there's definitely a strategy or problem that has to be coalesced around. But this is an example of us working backwards. So I do recommend, if you're really interested in seeing how that looks for public record keeping, is to visit a report like this on our website, and that will give you an idea of how much depth we get into with this particular framework and other work that we do. The other one that we look at, and this is based on the ISO standard for record keeping metadata, although we've developed it before it came out, it was based on the Dirks model that's out of Australia, is that we have developed a faceted classification scheme that takes all the complexities of government and breaks it down to different components that we can actually do for, concepts of linked data. How do we put this together to really understand what we're looking at? And we use this for appraisal. We use this for a variety of different reporting. We use this backwards and forwards in terms of it's as flexible to go back to a 1760 record and understand context as much as it is to do a 2021 record. And we also don't want to be subjective. Within the government sector, it's a very political aspect, but our role here is to just make sure that agencies and departments are managing the records and information and have them available to do the work that they have to do to serve the public. And so this gives us a good opportunity to look at government functions, to understand the legislation around them, to understand the public agencies that are held accountable for those different functions, and use key stable information. So each of these facets here actually can go historically back. So legislative acts, we can, do a lot of research going back, but it's all documented into a larger system that we call the Vermont Functional Classification System, or VCLASS. And these are all data sets. And the ability that we have through here is that we are able to do data-driven reporting on this. So here's an example of a report that was from earlier this year, where the task at hand was related to data privacy, specifically personally identifiable information, and wanting to know where in the government sector, where does it reside, and what's happening in terms of the management aspect. And using that model and the data that we actually collect, which gets down into the very specific record keeping requirements, we were able to show exactly which agencies and departments had personally identifiable information within the context of the law, where they were required to compile it, where they're required to share it, who they're required to share it with, what were the legal requirements around it, was it exempt or not exempt. So within the Public Records Act, personally identifiable information doesn't necessarily mean it's protected or exempt from public inspection and copying, but there are definitely a lot of examples with that in statute. And so this large report enabled us to be able to provide that fairly efficiently because we already had that model collecting all this information to understand government. And the last framework that we've really been coalescing around because of our responsibilities related to generally accepted record keeping principles and industry standards are the two that come out of ARMA, which is a national association. And this gives us a good balanced approach and for appraisal and also making record keeping decisions. So the first one is on the principles themselves. And so if you're not familiar with the 8 of them, accountability is getting who's actually responsible within that public agency. And that's a huge people part of that framework. That's people, processes, and technology, is who's accountable and what are their roles and responsibilities. And it's a really shared workspace when it happens. Transparency often in government gets translated to transparency in government and accountability level, but transparency in this model is about documentation. So people are able to understand how records and information are being managed and how decisions are being made on terms of their, whether it's life cycle, retention, disposition, what have you. Integrity, we also want to have authentic, reliable information. Protection, again, whether it's something that needs to be secure or something that just needs to make sure that it's not being inadvertently changed. Compliance at all different levels from a legal perspective, but also from a business process standpoint. And availability, the goal is always to have the right information to the right people at the right time. And then retention, disposition, that most people are familiar with in terms of how long do we need to keep it, and then what do we do in terms of whether it can be disposed in the sense of going to the archives because it's permanent, or can it be, if it's not permanent, be destroyed. And then getting really into the maturity level. And so part of our role coming in here is in 2008, being that we weren't created until that time frame, is that public agencies didn't have a records and information management program. It was managed in a way in the state that a lot of it had to do with just paper records and storage and saving kind of space and gravitating, at least at the state level, to using the state record center. So there's absolutely nothing to build on for them. And using this maturity model, we're able to work through where are they and how can we actually facilitate this mechanism for record keeping the state that's actually going to move them to this transformational, which is level 5. So they are using their information to provide the best service possible to the public. And they're not, in a state where it's nearly impossible for them to be able to work through all the different stages of how they're actually managing their information. So this is just, it's more qualitative. When I first started here, especially coming out of graduate school, I was really big into the grounded theory and working through diffusion of innovation theory. And so this is a lot of qualitative work that we've been doing and a lot of legislative reporting to kind of get there. But on the high level, oftentimes this is just a snapshot of us being asked to report and providing a report on to legislature about where agencies are. And the reference to TAP or TAP is that targeted assistance. We allocate actually members of our staff into the agencies. They do not have their own records managers, so to speak, but that's been one of our strategies and innovations that we've had in the state, is that we've actually built that. So starting, very early, and Human Services is the one on the screen right now, is in 2018, I approached them and said, we're expending a lot of resources, but you don't seem to be moving. Can I give you a resource? So out of my 19 people, actually took somebody and placed them in that agency. And it's been a wonderful experience. They have multiple records and information managers now. And they've also won last year, the National Association of Government Archives and Records Administration recognized them as having program excellence. So it took this framework of the accountability factor that needed to be addressed. But we also had to build a whole, information governance framework around for them. And it's been a really good positive experience. And so that's moving forward. Those are the kind of models that we look from the qualitative, what actually holds the agencies back. And the reason why iCare is not just so responsible for the statewide records and information management program, but we don't have much of a chance on the archival front if the agencies that are producing or acquiring the records don't already have them in a good manageable state there. So digital records and enterprise systems, our biggest sets that we look for is that we want to facilitate the indexing and classifying of it, and we don't want it to be manual. We have a whole legacy set of records to deal with in the paper world. We do not want that in the digital world, although we are sitting on legacy. We want to be able to make sure these systems are managing those compliance requirements, and some of those compliance is that it's an archival record. It needs to be preserved, and it needs to be on a right track for coming into the archives or being preserved in that way. We want to prepare things for continuous management. This gets back to being in an unmanaged state for such a long time, making sure that we're actually actively moving. It becomes part of the culture and becomes part of our operations, and then automate those workflows. So the goal one that we've had and we do have a digital archives and we use a digital preservation system, is that we want to have the automation occur. We want to have this just be part of the regular parts of state government, one part of the information IT architecture as well. And then this way, when retentions happen and the requirements come through, is that agencies, the biggest thing that we've had, and this is getting down into some of the trenches of working with the agencies as we try to pivot them towards a records management culture that they are not used to, is that because they have been responsible for so long, they've been kind of double dutying, so to speak, on, even our court system, for example. They have active needs to be able to provide services right now on current cases and current clients. However, they have been actually responsible for providing access to records going back to the 1700s. So part of this automation part is to allow them to do their job and do it well and not have to worry per se about, the things that we can take some responsibilities for, because we have the ability to take custody. Our strategy on this has been that our record schedules actually include the record keeping metadata. It does come out of a system. What you're seeing here is a report function, because it has to come out for a report function. But the things highlighted is examples of that faceted classification system, or the B-class Vermont functional classification system, in the sense that the first area is domain. This one happens to be related to Medicaid. The term is actually from CFR. It has a legal definition that's in our system tracked. We can point back to that. And then there's a certain activity that's a dictionary term. And then by statute, these two things are actually put together and assigned out to an agency. And so we're using this record keeping metadata. So what we're looking at is what are the bare minimum things that are going to help us identify it, going to be easy to implement inside a business system or an enterprise system, and also automate and facilitate this coming in, or determination of retention if it doesn't have to. The record type or category, that's at transaction level that we had on the Vermont functional classification system. These are, again, transaction types, applications. The transaction of applying to something generates a record, and that's a standardized term with a standardized definition. So one of the key parts is just using what is the bare minimum, and we look at these simplistic frameworks of how to move it faster. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way, but it definitely moves it faster in terms of what we want to look for automating. Second goal is just preservation. We want to have our digital preservation system established actually as enterprise repository for active records. These might be records that are ready to come into the archives or be transferred. These are records that are being created today. And so one of the different approaches that we've had for appraisal is that we know we appraise based on that function, and we don't do appraisal after the records are created. We know exactly what records are archival from the day they're created, so we can put them onto a track for that preservation piece, and that gives the protection that they need. So this is just an example as well, using a lot with looking at where these digital objects, how can we use different systems, and how can these systems be compatible to enable this preservation. And we're getting a lot of feedback from the agencies too about if they do have a particular system that they've been using, maybe a business application. They do not want the records necessarily to not be accessible to them. So we're working on different APIs and different ways of content management interaction to make sure those digital objects can be actually in another system, just the same as you would for any repository, but still be rendered and available and still be useful for the actual creating agency. And the last is this integration. So this record keeping metadata is exactly what we use in the archives for records that for our archival description as well. And so if we're able to integrate this part of it, it takes a huge weight off of us, particularly on the digital records front, for these records coming into the digital archives. And one of the reasons we need this is I can give a good example. So the governors, when they leave office, their records come to the state archives. The last governor who left, it was 3 cubic feet of paper records and 4 terabytes of information. We have 24 hours to turn it over to the public once we receive access. There is executive privilege, which means there's some records that would be, held or sealed for a certain period of time. But to receive 4 terabytes when you're not the creating office, and you are, you know the functions of it, but you need to deliver it to the public, and you also make sure that you're complying with all the different laws and requirements on that, and you have to make sure that you're not inadvertently providing access to something that's exempt, is very daunting. So this integration part is really key for us to take away that processing or post-processing after accessioning. It should all be streamlined in terms of what that record keeping metadata is. It tells us what it is. It gives a lot of parameters for the management responsibilities around that object, so to speak, or that core record, which is how we phrase it here for recorded information. And we absolutely have to do it for compliance, transparency, and integrity. So this integration is key for us. The 24-hour time period, we've done it. We've been able to do it. There's some other states that they don't have to provide access until it's processed, and you can go 5 or 6 years before the public actually has access. So our strategy for that has been really focused on this faceted classification and just the core parts: agency, who created it, standardized terminology, domain and activity, what is the subject of accountability, and what is the activity that's requested be performed by the agency, why is the context for that record being created, what is its record type. We've been able to find really good patterns for activities. If you have a permitting activity in the state, we know exactly what kinds of records you create. Your legislation might be slightly different, but we've been able to get it down to really good patterns. So our records and information management specialists and archivists are able to walk into an agency that maybe they haven't worked with and right away get them up into a management plan that has standardized terminology and moves forward. Legislation, at the end of the day, it's always about the compliance and what the expectations are around that. And so the screenshot here is more from our public portal. It's not the greatest interface, so we've been working on moving it out, but it gives the I just searched on my own name. And so what's shown here is that I show up in records from certain entities. And so I show up, obviously, this one just yielding a lot of legislative committees where I came up, but it gives the opportunity to say to someone, okay, well, I'd like to narrow it down. I'd like to better know, I'm looking for a record. I want this information about somebody. I can do a search and really get down to specifics. The other parts of the Vermont functional classification is people and also jurisdictions, meaning more places. Those are all functions that are related to the Secretary of State's office. We do a lot of statutory filings related to appointments, for example, so we're able to track people across time and the different roles that they've had in government sector. And same for jurisdictions. We were actually the official, I don't even know how to, I guess, repository, so to speak, but we're also the official information source for all jurisdictions within the state of Vermont, so municipalities and different districts and so forth. Legacy records. So this is what we're all sitting on, just terabytes and terabytes and terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of information. My goal in the state has always been moving something prospectively, because we know we have a lot of legacy and it doesn't matter what format that's in. Really want to analyze and prepare that and work through. And so I just did, this is just specifically related to file share as an example. We have file sharers all over in the state working through that. And when we came in as 2008, there was already a huge set to kind of dive into and work through. Our goal right here is to how can we simplify it and how can we use our different models to get to kind of harness that information, figure it out, and get it into a manageable state. And then how can we also protect it? So getting back to that data privacy reporting, and some of the key things is that we have a lot of information that is subject to exemptions that are at risk in terms of being inadvertently provided. And then how can we get this routine if we do a big cleanup? And using this, we do this also with the paper records. We call it retrospective analysis. We really, when we write a schedule or we have an appraisal, we do have to go back. There's many different circumstances where the appraisal decision may not be the same. Maybe some records are lost, and so it puts more dependencies on it. So how can we use all this information that we gather relate to just digital record keeping to help inform us on both fronts, regardless of format? Very evolving needs, and kind of lifting the hood and looking underneath and seeing that. Using lessons learned, we use that a lot, and cooperative framework. So we're just one entity of many in different disciplines that have to work together. So getting into just the tales of the trenches in terms of some other work that we've been doing related to legacy and making decisions is that we've been looking at testing different information governance platforms and how can they help us sort through hundreds of file shares and terabytes of data. So we just did one with 5 terabytes with an agency that we've been collaborating with, and using the different tools to get a sense of age, which helps with availability. They may be trying to go through a lot of stuff that maybe shouldn't have been there anymore because they maybe were up for retention and disposition. Also just starting to get a better sense that in many cases, and this gets into the definition of public records, that it's anything produced or acquired in the state course of agency business, regardless of format. In many cases, we think about these things as being your typical office kind of records, your textual documents, your word processing, your spreadsheets that might come for that. Instead, we're really seeing huge sets of systems. So finding, for example, that perhaps someone had used an application and then they had just dropped the data in there. So it's different kinds of system files and trying to problem solve around those. So this is giving us a good lay of the land, and also trying to help us, again, we want the agencies to be successful. They should be focusing on their current services and information needs and helping them move this stuff along in the life cycle. Duplicates also, we're raising a big issue related to that 2-to-1 in terms of some of this going through. So some of the things that we've been doing on tackling this is looking at really good ways to use rules and customize them to facilitate the indexing and classification. So we're not doing it manually. What we're actually doing is looking at different ways to search across the whole spectrum and to really pinpoint those particular sets of information and sets of records that are attributed on those record schedules. So the screenshot here is just looking at some Boolean searches that we've been doing to look for different sets of records that meet that record type that we have in the schedule, and also within that domain and activity. So this is pretty innocuous. This is business office kinds of record types and a record schedule that, but getting right into testing it, using the logic and what we know about the records themselves. And some of that comes from us, working with them in a paper front and translating it now to look across terabytes and terabytes and terabytes of just objects and putting some framework around them and understanding what they are, besides just a huge set of individual file folders and files. Also, for finding and mitigating and quarantining certain records, that's a key part of what we have to do. We have to be accountable for that, and using the same kind of strategy to go across all these different things. Again, just a screenshot related to PII in that part. And then mapping to record schedules. So that's really the goal, is that if something is eligible for destruction, is overdue for destruction, we want it gone. If something is ready to be transferred to the archives or is permanent but not ready to be transferred, we want it on that other track. So how are we bridging that for new modern records and things that are being created and received today? And also, how are we going back? And the servers are at least to the mid-90s in terms of Vermont state information. And so again, so a lot of work that our records and information management specialists and archivists do is then use these different tools and background to strategize on how they're doing their appraisal and their analysis. So this is just an example, and you can see some of the different file shares that come up, and one's called Rebecca, which I'm sure means a lot to everybody here and trying to figure out what that is, but that's the lay of the land that we have to work with, and being able to actually use those mitigation tools and those analysis tools to understand that is actually aligning with record schedules and set records that we know. In terms of what we do, it's just not to underestimate interdependency. So I'm just one entity, and I'm in the Secretary of State's office, which is an elected official. A lot of the work that we do and collaborate with other elected officials who have their own staff and their own responsibilities and perhaps their own approaches to how they want to do things. So everything that we do is working through other people. And for the most part, it's working through the public agencies as a whole at the local and state level for the archives, records, and information management. All policy development work has to work through agency records officers. So by law, there's a records officer responsibility. It's a duty is otherwise assigned, but that's one of the areas that we've been looking at and trying to expand and make sure that we have actual people who are records and information managers in those agencies to support those programs. And actually, University of Maryland graduate just got hired and starts on Tuesday next week for one of our agencies, which we're very excited about. And data and metadata management, the chief data officer. That chief data officer is in a different part of the executive branch. So we have to collaborate and figure things out. Integrated shared services, almost all our enterprise systems are managed by the chief information officer. So working together with his team, and we're right in the weeds often on, I can't even begin to describe the sense of having to use. We use a lot of proprietary systems in Vermont. We're almost always doing that technology up approach and having to sort through that. It's not the best technology that we're always using, and having to figure through that. And the legal requirements and compliance with the Vermont legislature. Because I'm in the Secretary of State, we typically describe that we report to legislature. That's who we tend to report to. So when I look at what we have to do, it's multidisciplinary. I didn't even touch on a lot of different strategies and things that we're doing, but with a staff of 19 and the broad functions that we have, the multidisciplinary aspect of what we need within our own staff is pretty key, but also the fact that we need to be interdisciplinary to start moving at a bigger approach. It's not just about my staff, it's about a bigger group of partners that have to work together. And, the transdisciplinary component is what we all want to be, but in government sector, that's even harder to achieve. So for me, it's about making sure my staff is very multidisciplinary, and it comes from everything from policy to operations to understanding technology, but also users. Spending a lot of time understanding, the government sector and what the average employee, I know when I get off of this call, I'm going to help somebody use an application that they just can't figure it out. But we need a lot of multidisciplinary, but it doesn't get it over the hurdle for what we need for the larger record keeping. So some of the things that we've been changing on, and this is really my last slide, is results-oriented framework. So at the end of the day, when I look at the archives and what we're responsible for is really to make sure people have access to the records that they need when they want them, and that they're the right records and they're the appropriate records and they're what we have appraised as being archival, and that we can authenticate it. They're reliable and accurate. So on this chart, if you think about that, we have these hubs. So we have all these agency services that has to get us through that, and we have responsibilities around that. We have repositories, all these different systems, whether it's paper or electronic, these are all different repositories and systems that have to work through. And we have responsibilities around that. Accessions, we have responsibilities to take custody of archival records that meet certain criteria and make sure that they're available to current and future generations. And then we have this whole administrative aspect of what we do. And so when we look at appraisal and how we've tackled it, that leads right into the data controls that we need inside the repositories. And that leads right into the processing that I do want to get out of and not be doing prospectively. We have a whole backlog of retrospective to do, that it feeds right into the requests. And in many cases, those requests now are in terms of public records requests, we have a lot that we receive that we don't have to take any action on. So if they're coming into the digital archives, it is somewhat a self-serve. We might help somebody do a search, but otherwise it's available and it's there for them to do on their own without having to go through a step of making a request. And us, for example, in the paper world, have to make a copy or provide inspection ability through a reference room. And then the life cycle works the same way. So our management plans and these record schedules set the life cycle, which then can move towards internal controls that, whether it's a paper facility or a digital facility, they're all the same controls and they're systematic in how they have to process. And then the preservation component that we have for the archival records, and that ends up being to the ability to show that it's authentic and reliable. So it gets back to that discipline, coordinated and measurable. That's what we've been working towards in terms of different digital strategies that we have for both the state archives and also for the agencies themselves for things that aren't coming in. That's the bulk of the records that we have in public records world are things that are not archival, but they're still needed for the time being for what the services that are being provided. And that is the end of my talk.
Thank you, Tanya. This is great.
Would you like me to stop sharing my screen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
It's a terrific overview of sort of a snapshot of state of the art of what a innovative organization at a state level is all about. Let me say, I know my colleague Doug Ord has a question in the chat, and I'll get to it in a second, but I do want to ask one question first, which is, how has COVID changed state government? And you can go in any direction you want, but I'm interested in whether there's certain types of data that are being collected that weren't collected before, and is that data expected to somehow work its way into the archives?
Sure. So, well, as everybody, we're all working electronically for the most part, so we all are really good with using cameras and so forth. Our statistics, obviously the impact of services, we've had to make a lot of changes in how we've done that. We did reopen though to the public fully in June of 2020. So those have been able to do that. The biggest change that we've had is the state of Vermont's been doing a lot of data modeling related to COVID. And that is something that they've done in terms of their health surveillance, but not something to the scale that they've done, and also reporting. So during the state of emergency that we had for the governor's state of emergency, there was literally reports every single day. So the types of records haven't actually changed. It's just the volume of them and the very specific subject of them. So when it comes to stuff the Department of Health has been working through and the different data models that they've been doing on COVID and COVID specific, is that we've been looking at how to, the whole data set, because it's been analyzed over time, we're looking at different snapshots on how to take that. It's not really the best approach per se, but it's also the outcomes of those particular sets of records. They were important at the time, but there's also some derivatives of that are more persistent to be valuable over time as well. So I think that's been the biggest change. A lot of things don't affect the archives as much because they're more transitory based or they're operational based. So they're during the state of emergency, they had elevated use and needs, but they did not long-term use and needs in terms of record keeping.
Great. Okay. I invite Doug to actually come in. I'm going to ask his question, but he might wish to have a follow-up. Doug is asking, how accurate are the rules that you use? I'm assuming this is to be sort of classifying or categorizing records at various agencies. And he asked, would it be useful to have some systems that could learn from those rules to recognize documents that are similar to those that the rules were able to find? This is an information retrieval question in search of the holy grail of records management. So.
Yeah, some very good questions. So one of the things that we've been doing with that retrospective, and we're doing a couple pilots actually right now, and that was probably bigger thing that we've done during COVID is we were able to move forward with a lot of pilots, is looking at different information governance tools that we can train. And so that was one of those examples, that writing the different rules for what we knew about the records, also how they mapped over to the requirements and different information that we've had within the B-class system, and then watching and running analysis to see how well the system could identify those and what we needed to tweak or not tweak. And the goal would be that we could apply the same rules to discovery, right? So this is still discovery for us to understand for record keeping, but the same technology and approach can then be used for discovery to facilitate public access in a different way as well.
Okay.
It's pretty good if you know the records. You know, so I should add that, you know, we worked with different technologists who were surprised on how well that Boolean logic was developed and had not seen that. And so some of that I, you know, attribute back to having that multidisciplinary background, right? And so I remember writing all sorts of Boolean logic, you know, in graduate school, and having that ability to do that. So so that comes to just having, you do have to know something to be able to get something in return, but using the different technologies to be, I don't want our staff to be, I want it to be systematic and down to a science. And in some ways for public record keeping, it is very systematic. It's just disorganized and it doesn't necessarily have a layer of organization. And that's what we're trying to put onto it.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions from our faculty members. One is, can you talk a little more about who your users tend to be and what needs they have, and then also whether there are metrics. Have agencies come up with a way of measuring, equating online collections use versus in-person reading room use? So who are the users, the archives, and you know, what's the metrics on online collections versus in-person reading rooms?
Sure. So I can start with the records that they're used the most, and they are actually our legislative records. So we're a legislative intent state, and we have multifaceted use of different aspects for the legislative records. So for us, being a public agency, it can come down to someone asking for something that they have for their personal use or need, or even a record related to themselves, or their family in some way, not necessarily genealogy, could be some other aspect of it. There is no defined single user. When it comes to that, the sets of records that we see the most use out of are the court records, but a variety of different reasons and different typical users. So we have a lot within the state government. We have a lot of attorneys. We have a lot of just general citizens. It really depends on the record. It's a hard question to answer. It's not the typical being able to show like, oh, we have someone who's coming in to do family history research. Yes, we do have them, but because we're a government entity and because of the sets of records that we have, a lot of it has to do more with legal and accountability. And attorneys in particular are often some of our biggest users.
I can vouch for that. So a
lot of lawsuits.
Yes. So we have a lot of students here, and I encourage them to ask a question. But let me ask you. You come from the iSchool, and you've been now involved in a lot of technological innovations that probably were just not on anybody's radar screen when you were a student here. So everyone who's experiencing this webinar, it's going to be technology from the rest of our careers. The question is, what kind of skills are needed of students coming out of an MLIS program or any of the programs offered by the iSchool, grad or undergrad, to succeed in a career? And I know you and I had spoken before about kind of the merging of records management and archival skill sets and the kind of positions you offer. So what advice would you give?
I will say what I look for, and we often have vacancies. So we have one now. If anybody's listening and interested in Vermont after this, is you know, for me, you have to be you have to be across all these different disciplines, and you have to be able to see the connections for that. So the recommendation I have is if you're looking at the government sector and you're looking into public records and information, we do the continuum here, which means that everything from the agency up to us is it's just a continuum. We are equally responsible for not only just the record keeping, but understanding the context for why those records were created. So in terms of my background, what I found was most valuable for me being in graduate school and just happening to kind of be in Vermont and come into this role just to help facilitate some work and then staying was a lot with, you know, user and information seeking behavior. So having that background, information storage and retrieval systems is dating myself in terms of the terminology that was pretty frequently used, but understanding how to organize information and how to collect the right information that's going to help move something in a different direction, and how to actually set that up, how to architect that. You know, I channeled back to some of the things that I didn't quite understand as a graduate student, and then immediately came into the state of Vermont in this chaotic, you know, kind of state of there was not even an electronic index to anything in the archives. Granted, it was only 1,500 cubic feet, but to not even have something in electronic format to let people know. So the ability to kind of combine those things. I also took a lot for information policy. Lee Strickland had been at University of Maryland at the time, and understanding the responsibilities and the legal requirements around record keeping. Again, it may not be applicable and translate to someone who's not in the government sector, but for me, it's like having to understand the legality of it and being able to research legislation, understanding the different components of government and being able to see across the branches and the local government and find commonalities that we can build on. And then the sociology component and survey methodology are also two areas that I studied when I was at University of Maryland, and putting those together to understand the big ecosystem that we have and the relationships that have to be built and developed from that. But strong IT, but also being able to get into the more social aspects of it and the information components as well.
That's a really good summary and sort of overview of that. So I'm going to pause for a second. I don't see any yellow hands in the corner of the Zoom screens, but is there someone who wants to step out and say something directly to Tanya? And I will just wait a few seconds. I see Ellen. You have to unmute yourself, or we have to. You're not. There you are.
I am aware there may be some feedback, but I think it has to do with where my computer is located as opposed to my computer itself. So I apologize in advance for that. So I'm in the MLIS program starting my second year, and I thought I was a little late, so I may have missed some of your background, but you said you were in the University of Maryland and you were in Vermont, and you just ended up working for the government. I was just wondering, like, because Vermont is a very small state and not known for having, you know, major urban areas and things like that. So I was just curious if that's where you're from originally, or how you ended up there specifically.
Sure. It was a quality of, so we decided to move to Vermont and made that change. And I had, you know, at that point, I had actually had 3 kids, 3 and under. So I was planning on staying home for a little bit, and I had circulated my name though, so I wanted to keep current and understand. And the Secretary of State's office reached out to me about 3 months after we moved here and said, we passed this new legislation. You're an archivist. We're not really sure how to go forward. Would you be interested? And I said, sure. It is part-time and it's contract archivist, and, you know, came in here, and I had been at University of Maryland. I had worked with the National Archives. I had worked with Smithsonian. I was not prepared at all, and started channeling and remembering different references that were made to Vermont. The original state archives was actually in a house with the archives in the basement. So when I'm saying we're starting with where we're starting and where we are now is very different. But came in and just used the different things. I actually had a dissertation proposal, and that was related to V-Class, and walked in here and said, okay, it doesn't look like you have any system to be able to even locate and identify where you have records now. It doesn't sound like we have a lot of information about even how to identify records that should be coming into the archives. Even though we didn't have the authority to funnel them, we didn't even have the capability or understanding of, there was no appraisal prior to coming in. So yeah, it was just a call out of the blue, and just, I guess to throw it out there too, is it was maybe 6 or 7 months after I started that I understood that the consultant who helped facilitate that initial law was Bruce Dearstein, who was my advisor at Maryland. And then a couple, maybe a year into that, the state archivist at the time, who's retired, Gregory Sanford, had told me, hey, I was telling a friend about the work that we're doing here, and he's coming to, he's coming to Vermont to see you. And I was like, that was great. And so I came around the corner, it was Terry Cook. And so if you know Terry Cook and you're part of that, that time frame from the Archives of Canada, he was also one of my advisors. And so we literally, I was just a warm body of an archivist who they hired. And here I had all these different connections through the University of Maryland that were just circumstance afterwards. But we did a lot of planning, a lot of reporting, a lot of strategizing. And so that was what enabled us to move and become the Vermont State Archives and Records Administration, and really build on that within the Secretary of State's office. But yeah, it was unrelated. Just wanted a quality of life change, really related to our kids. So that's how we ended up in Vermont. My husband's a statistician, so he's good.
I knew that's a great story and a great end to our hour. I want to thank you so much for giving us your time. And I know it's really interesting insights into what you have been doing. So thank you. And I thank everybody. This will be up on YouTube, and look forward to seeing you all at the next Cafe Speaker event on the first Wednesday of every month. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.